Hello, everyone. Welcome to Let's Talk Off the Podium. I have the president and CEO of New Music USA, Vanessa Reed. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, I just realized when we scheduled for you to come on that you've been with the New Music USA for only a year. Is that right?
Yeah, just over a year. I moved across to New York last August. So yeah, I've been celebrating my 1 year anniversary, seven
Wow.
months of which have been in lockdown.
Wow. That congratulations. And it's such a crazy time to lead another major organization in a new place, in a different place, new organization, and this whole pandemic is happening. I know you've done projects. I've seen your website. You've done projects over this time. What are some of those projects that you've done over the past year, especially specific to the pandemic time period?
Of course. I mean, I think, what's important about an organization like New Music USA is that it should always be responding and keeping check on the needs of our community. So it was obviously a shock to all of us, in March when the global pandemic became clear and we all had to, change the way we work, as everyone has. But we were really inspired to be approached very quickly by some leading composers and performers like Claire Chase and Marcos Bolter, who were, really trying to find a way that they could help, the independent performers that we all knew were sort of taking the first hit. They suddenly had, lots of cancelled performances for several months in front of them, and we know that they were going to be feeling panicked and in dire sort of financial needs. So we worked with Claire Marcos and a committee of artists to launch the New Music Solidarity Fund.
Mm.
And I really like the way that was a collaboration between us and the community. It's not just an institutional kind of result or response. It's something that was done together with the community. And I think that's why the fundraising was so successful. So we raised over $500,000. We've supported over 1,000 independent performers. And of course, you just end up knowing and feeling that it's still a drop in the ocean, but at least we know we've helped all of those people in some way. And now at New Music USA, we're continuing with that kind of thinking and shifting our focus now to composers and music creators, which have always been very central to New Music USA's history with American Music Center and Meet the Composer, and are present with New Music USA's focus on generally improving conditions for new music. So we're going to be launching in the next few weeks a new program called the Music Creator Development Fund, which is going to offer grants of up to $5,000 to US-based music creators and composers who can use that money to help stimulate collaboration with other artists or help them get to the next stage of their composing and to keep going in these extraordinary circumstances, which for some have been incredibly difficult when it comes to, creating and writing music. And it hasn't been the same for everyone, but we know that, the impact of COVID has, as there's been a lag when it comes to composers, because to start with, no one knew quite if commissions need to be cancelled or not. And I think now we're hearing many more stories about composers and music creators feeling concerned about the next year.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tough time. A little bit about, and I don't know how much these projects, because you're doing so many projects, how much are they connected? But you just made an announcement about the Amplifying Voices co-commissions. A little bit about that specifically, and how you've picked the people that you've picked for that. I think it's 6 artists, and just a little bit about that project.
Sure. So I've always been aware of the work of Sphinx organization in Detroit. So even when I was based in London, I really looked up to their work. I think it's exemplary, and they've been, early kind of game changers when it comes to looking at the importance of elevating and including more Black and Latinx voices in classical music. And so, early on, after I moved to New York, I started looking at what they were doing, and they launched this new ventures fund. And through kind of a lot of thinking and discussion with my team and also with Sphinx, we came up with this program that was trying to look at how we could address in a sustainable way the lack of repertoire that's being promoted in the orchestral sector that's by Black and Latinx composers. And we're really thinking there about repertoire that already exists, as well as repertoire that could be commissioned for a future canon that's more representative of the diverse world we live in. So we started talking to orchestras, because New Music USA has done a lot of work with the orchestral sector in the past. We had a very long running program called Music Alive, which we ran in partnership with the League of Orchestras, which was supporting composers in residence. And there have been some fantastic composers like Gabriella Frank and Hannibal Lacumbe and Lembit Beecher and many others, Anna Klein, you know, who were involved in those programs. But this time, I really wanted to think about how we could get orchestras to work together to really strengthen the sector impact they might be able to have. So we've helped them be inspired to create 8 consortia of orchestras. Each has at least 4 orchestras in the consortium, and each of those are co-commissioning a composer. They're all incredibly exciting. You can find out about them on the website. But you know, you've got people like Shelley Washington through to Tanya Leon. So across, you know, generation and different styles and different perspectives, there's a really exciting group of people there. So the idea is that with the restrictions, those co-commissions will start coming through in the 21-22 season. And before then, we're going to be working closely with the participants and other industry guests on some in-depth conversations about how we can enable and empower composers to have a seat at the artistic planning table within the orchestras, and to also help artistic planners discover works they might not be aware of, hear more about composers who may not still be alive, whose work hasn't been played enough, or to hear about other composers they could be co-commissioning or commissioning right now. And I think I've always been passionate about that big challenge in the new music world, which is the cult of the premiere, and you know, this obsession with just commissioning one-off performances, essentially, that only ever get heard by one audience. And I actually think we're depriving audiences of a chance to get familiar with contemporary repertoire. You know, we complain that they don't want to hear it, but at the same time, in a way, it's no surprise because they just haven't been able to get familiar with much of it. You know, so I think that's the kind of status quo that we really need to move forward.
Yeah, you know, I completely agree with what you said there, and the problem again with just having one performance, like you said, is because one audience hears it, and sometimes whether it's a performance or a bad day for the person listening to it, it might not affect them the same way. So whether it's the same audience, it might be a person who comes in and listens to the same piece again and really has a different experience, or just reaching more audiences in general. It's very important, I think. And I bring the analogy of my son. He's 1, and we're trying to give him various different foods. And sometimes for the first time he tries something, it's like, oh, I don't really like this, or you could tell that he doesn't want it. But then you try it again 3 or 4 days later, he's like, okay, this is not that bad. So, you know, I think the same thing applies to music. We get used to so much with composers that we're familiar with, and sometimes it's a composer, the work might not be great, but it's like that composer, we know the name, like, okay, it's still great. Even if the work is okay, it's still great just because we know the name, it's so familiar.
Exactly.
Yeah. Did you want to add something else?
No, I mean, I just think you're right. Our brains are kind of wired to respond more emotionally to something that's familiar. And so we really have to find a way to enable people to hear new music as part of everyday life. You know, I think that's why it's also important in education that young people get to hear music by living composers or play it in the school, you know, in the orchestra, or through any, you know, music making that they're involved with, because otherwise you just end up stuck in the past. And I think it's interesting, you know, we've had various group discussions with composers and other people from the new music community across the whole of the US actually. And, you know, somebody raised a point which I thought was kind of scary in a way, which is, you know, if we project forward, you know, a few hundred years from now, there's this kind of worry that actually no one will kind of know what music was created now because it's not being shared or promoted or broadcast enough. And people will still be looking way back to Beethoven and the many anniversaries we might celebrate for him instead of actually knowing who the people of our time were.
Yeah, that's great. I actually want to switch gears a little bit because I know you've done so much work on, you know, in the UK, and I know this is about New Music USA, but a little bit about your work so the audience knows what you've done before joining New Music USA. Just some of the projects maybe that really meant a lot to you working with your previous organization.
Sure. I mean, I've always really loved working with composers and being somehow involved in supporting the creative process. So my very first job was actually with the British equivalent of the American Music Centre.
Mm.
And both of those organisations have now merged into different new organisations. But, you know, that's where I first got to really understand, you know, challenges for unpublished composers, the joy of being able to discover so many new pieces of music every week as I followed their work, you know, being based in London, where obviously there were lots of live concerts at that time. That was the late 90s. And then I moved into other roles. I traveled a bit, lived in Amsterdam, where I worked for European Cultural Foundation and developed my skills in grant making and policy development, you know, for the arts sector. Did a brief stint in Brussels at the European Commission, again in culture and education. And then in the UK, all of that came together in one organisation, the PRS Foundation, which is specialising in new music, but also a really important funding body. And because I was there for a decade, I was really able to build and transform that organisation so that we were able to trickle the resources we could give to the new music community and also zoom in on certain kinds of creators or communities or music genres that we hadn't supported as much as I think we should have in the past. So I'm really hoping that we can, you know, use some of that experience here at New Music USA, and you can already see that I'm doing that with Amplifying Voices, for example, and also with an ambition to really put at the heart of our new strategic plan the aim of getting more resources to the artists and organisations who need it here in the US, even more than they needed it in the UK, just because there are less, you know, less funders of the arts in the US.
Mhm.
And I think, you know, in terms of favourite projects, I became very passionate about the imbalances in the new music community in the UK, and not, you know, this is across all genres. And some of it is just about once you notice something, you just can't stop noticing it. So back in 2011, we were just really puzzled by the complete lack of proposals we were receiving for commissions that involved female composers. And we did a bit of research to, you know, discovered that only 16% of the applications we were receiving were from women. We looked at the Collecting Society membership, discovered that it was only 13% female. So we started acting in a very direct way in response to that, and we launched the first ever fund that was targeted only at female composers and songwriters, and then that led to a much larger international campaign called Keychange, which I developed with European partners. And that's where, you know, we succeeded in getting over 300 festivals and other music organizations to sign up to a gender balance pledge for 2022. And I think, you know, with all of this, for me, there is the importance of gender justice and social justice, but there's also the importance of ensuring that the music we're sharing is as interesting and brilliant and diverse and inspiring as it can be. So I strongly believe that if you open up your talent pool, if you're recruiting artists from a broader range of places, and if you're enabling all voices within our society to be represented, then ultimately the musical experience itself will be better, and it will be much more fair and equitable and representative of the 21st century.
Yeah, and I've had so many people from UK that have joined the podcast. I've had quite a few people, composers and conductors and performers from UK, and I've always asked them this question. Um, and I know it's a tough one, it's a big one to compare, but based on what the type of work you do, what are some positives and negatives for both countries, whether it's the funding from the government or private funding, or just the general acceptance of new music and women composers and other things, just based on your experiences, how does the US compare to the UK? I know it's
Oh,
a big general statement, but it's
that's
just
a
if you
difficult
can.
question. I know, but no, it's a great question, and obviously I do think about it every now and then because I have experience of both. I've only been here for a year, so I'm still learning a lot. Um, there is an absolute abundance of talent in both countries, so that's where we need to start. I think maybe because the UK is a smaller island, I think there is more aspiration to be an international composer or musician in the UK than there is in the US. I feel like there is such an urgency here to just find the resources to keep going. And then the US is a very big country already. I was kind of surprised by the relatively small number of US composers that are, regularly promoted in the UK, and they tend to be, obvious. It's Philip Glass, Steve Reich, John Adams, and then there's another layer of published composers. But when I come here and discover how incredibly diverse and brilliant the new music scene is, I would, really wish that more of those voices were being heard in Europe and in the UK. So that's one slight difference. When it comes to social justice in new music, I think in the US, the discussion is much more honest and much more open. And also at the same time, kind of, it's more challenging and more confrontational. But I actually think, it's much more truthful. Whereas in the UK, I feel like we've always sort of brushed over our role in the slave trade. We've kind of not really talked about it in an open way. And yes, we've always had schemes, but we've never talked deeply about why and where they come from and the historical significance of of what needs to change. Whereas here, there's a real push for you to look inside yourself and to look at your role in the structures that are still perpetuating now. So I think that's a difference. I'm just trying to think what else. I mean, I think there are shared trends which I think are always exciting around how to reach new audiences, and I suppose the common thread there. And I remember John Adams saying this to me when I met him in LA for the first time, because I went to one of the Green Umbrella concerts pre-COVID. And we were talking about, where is the most exciting energy coming from in the new music world? And he said, it's really great that New Music USA is focused on that kind of artist-led, small to medium-sized ensembles, kind of independent community, because they are the ones that are feeding up amazing ideas to the bigger institutions. That's where the interesting work is. And I think, that's the same in the UK, and you'll find, more and more institutions in air quotes kind of working with those people because they know they've got the capacity to bring new audiences in. So people like, the London Contemporary Orchestra and Gabriel Prokofiev in the UK have done great work in that area. And, and there are, equivalents here who will be also kind of doing things in a different way, using different kinds of spaces, and yeah, changing the kind of rhythm and image of new music in all its forms.
Yeah. You're doing so many projects with New Music USA. I don't even know where to start, but something maybe New Music Box, for example, a little bit about that and what you do with that particular area of your organization.
Sure. I mean, New Music Box is a treasure trove of incredible articles written across the past 21 years. And the idea of New Music Box has always been to give a platform to artists and composers in their own voices. So, Frank J. Oteri, the editor, has been interviewing people monthly for 21 years. And when you look at the list of people who've been interviewed, it's really incredible. So it's a great place for anyone to start if they want to explore what's been happening and what is happening in new music. And I think the thing I noticed as I was interviewing for the job, last year, is how bold and kind of ahead of the curve New Music Box was even last year, when it was continually publishing a really pretty controversial range of articles and discussions around pressing issues relating to equity and representation, particularly in classical music or in contemporary classical music, where people are now talking on a regular basis about where white supremacy can be identified in the structures, and in the way we talk about this music. So I think it's a great place to discover a lot of those debates, and we're also, of course, wanting to make sure it keeps evolving with the times, and we're going to be looking at new formats and different ways of engaging more people. And I think, the other question for all of us is, how do you define new music? And I'm going to put that to you before you ask me that question, because that usually happens in an interview. And I think, what I think is that, of course, an organization like New Music USA is here for music creators, composers, and artists who are not working in the commercial sector. They need our support. They want to be part of our community. But we are just as open to a contemporary jazz artist as we are experimental or contemporary classical, or other kinds of traditional music translated into a contemporary context. And I think my personal preference is that I just find genre labels very limiting, and the most interesting artists are pretty hard to describe, because they're kind of, they're not really one thing or the other, and they're sort of pulling from different places. And at the end of the day, there's great music and there's bad music, and you want to be kind of really focusing on what's got something to say, what's distinctive, and what's original. So one of the areas that I want to make sure we build with New Music Box is also just making sure voices from that whole community can be represented.
Mhm. And that's great, because I've had quite a few artists who have come on recently, especially, who have been very careful about putting themselves in a certain genre. And I think living in the 21st century, you really have to be open to all these new possibilities in music. And I think the great composers and artists from the past were also open to new possibilities. That's why it's grown. But especially in the 21st century, having access to so much information more than ever gives us the opportunity, and this is a great opportunity, to be able to explore the different places that you've never been to. And the one organization, I've had the honor of having David Harrington from Kronos Quartet on the podcast. He was actually one of the early people. Is that one thing I appreciated, and I appreciate about the Kronos Quartet, is that they were never afraid to say, okay, we're going to go to this country that doesn't really have Western classical composers, and we're going to work with them. We're going to include their instruments and folk music and make it part of what we do. And that's what attracted me to their organization years ago, when I was interested in what they're doing. So that's really very important in the 21st century, as we have information, and we're able to go anywhere in the world with just the computer, internet. It's really great. I do want to ask you about the New Music Connect, a little bit about that, please.
Oh, yeah. I mean, New Music Connect is a fairly kind of straightforward way in which we build relationships with people who are passionate about new music as listeners, audience members, or kind of hobbyists,
Mhm.
commissioners, so they've got lots of relationships with composers and they want to commission work through our networks, if you like. So, there are so many people that apply to us who can't get support just because there are, because of the numbers. So we get 1,400 applications and we can only fund 120. Those kinds of statistics are really tricky to deal with. So we're basically wanting to connect with patrons who are interested in supporting some of the projects that we can't support. So once we've kind of come up with our final shortlist, we'll obviously have another 100 that we could easily fund if we had more money, because they're all great quality. So let's see if we can connect new donors to those.
And when you connect them, you let go of that kind of project and you let them work on their own. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it
Okay.
will ultimately end up being a relationship between the commissioner and the project. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. We talked a little bit about the barriers, but anything that, comes to mind that's really a big barrier, whether it's getting to a new audience, whether it's a project that you're trying to do at New Music USA that's not working, just something that is kind of a barrier to what you're trying to do, the next steps and what you're trying to do, if there's something that you're willing to share. I know there's probably many things that might be private, but is there anything that you're willing to share that's a barrier and you're trying to overcome that?
Sure. I mean, in terms of thinking about the community that we're supporting, I guess what we're trying to do is to be very sensitive to what the biggest challenges are and how our funding, or any more funding we could raise, would have the most impact.
Mhm.
And the thing that I'm quite interested in really kind of bringing back into our conversation now, because we just mentioned it a moment ago, is this challenge around getting every person within the business of kind of creating new music somehow connected beyond their own immediate circle. Because I think different kinds of music creators have similar challenges, um, and yet they're not necessarily able to learn from each other. And same goes for different kinds of new music non-profits who were, as you were just saying earlier, trying to reach an audience, or trying to contribute to the future of music through their promotion of new work. They're all going to face similar problems around fundraising, around audience development, around getting coverage, around finding the right venue. But then there aren't many spaces created where they can actually speak together about that, or indeed make sure they make the time to do that. So I think one of the challenges for us is actually just going to be, how can we raise a really significant amount of additional money that will enable us to go much deeper in the way that we support our community. And particularly, I suppose, the biggest straightforward challenge for an organisation like New Music USA is that we are a national organisation based in New York with funding that is also connected to New York for certain programs. So our project grants, for example, are open to people from across the whole country, but around 50% of the budget needs to go to New York-based artists and organizations. So the big challenge there is that we end up being known as the organization who has rejected someone. So if you think about the fact that 1,200 people will be rejected by us in a grants application round, how do you transform that into a good relationship? What else can we do to then make sure these people don't feel alienated from our work? And so very first thing I did, as soon as I joined last autumn, was make sure we were much more clear in our grant guidelines about why more money was going to New York. So we hadn't really explained that in the headlines. So, we said, this is where our money is going to go. this is part of the rationale as to, you know, why you'll see that more organizations and artists are selected from New York. So that's why I think what I would love to do is build some new partnerships and find additional support that will enable us to also target our funding to other cities which might have access to less resource.
Mhm. And next year, from what I understand, is the 20th anniversary year for New Music USA, right?
10th anniversary.
Oh, 10th, sorry,
Yeah, so
10th anniversary,
it's the 10th
2011.
anniversary since the merger of American Music Centre and Meet the Composers. So yeah, it's going to be a big year and an opportunity to kind of look back, look forward, celebrate, and see what we can do that will enable us to really secure more resource for this incredibly important community that is looking after the future of our art form that we love so much, which is music.
Wow. And for 10th anniversary, this is a significant organization that was able to uh, build such a momentum and have someone like you who has international experience to lead them now. So that's such a big accomplishment for a relatively young organization compared to, you know, some of these great orchestras in the US that have, you know, 100-year history, for example. So that's really amazing. A little bit about your background. I know we talked about your background as an artistic administrator, but I want to know, go even further back and ask you if you've played an instrument. How did this lead you to be an artistic administrator, artistic leader? What was the early years of your life as a young musician, I'm assuming?
Yeah, so I grew up in a musical family in that my mum was a pianist and organist, just a amateur, but she was always playing. There was always music in the house. So I learned the clarinet and the piano quite early on, and did all of my exams. And and I thought about going to conservatoire, but in the end, I also was not so keen on, funnily enough, the isolation of practicing all day long if you want to be a soloist, or kind of, writing a piece all day long if you're going to be a composer. And I also did some composing as part of my education. So I kind of realized that because I was studying languages too, I studied French and music together at university. I wanted to play a role where I would be interacting and communicating and supporting artists and the music that I love, and that exciting sense of being part of the unknown and the creative process and the future. And for some reason, I just got really fascinated with experimental and contemporary music I think it was when I was about 16. I remember being fairly unusual because a lot of the people at these new music concerts were guys. There weren't so many women. And when I was doing my degree, I spent a year in Paris, and I decided to write my thesis for my degree, which I had to do in French, on the way that the French were kind of managing the distribution of contemporary music and the funding of contemporary music in Paris. And I think I called it something like the de-ghettoization of new music. And it was about the influence of Boulez on the building of these institutions like Cité de la Musique, which was a really powerful development in urban regeneration in a sort of low-income area of Paris, but with these amazing facilities. And then obviously he was responsible for Urcam as well. But it was really fascinating to see how much a composer was influencing politicians and the use of public money. And I don't think that's really happened in many places. I mean, the equivalent in the UK would be Simon Rattle, the conductor, has had a lot of influence on, investment. They were thinking pre-COVID about a potential new music concert hall, which was pretty controversial, but Simon Rattle was really backing it. And, it was actually looking like it was going to happen. So I think, looking at the way that artists and people from our community can influence much more kind of transformational developments in society or in public funding, at least, I think is quite fascinating. So that's, that's part of my story. But I've always been very eclectic in my taste, and particularly more than anything, I've loved live music. So I've always been very energetic about going out to gigs at least 3 or 4 times a week. So this period has been really challenging for me on that front.
A couple of more questions for you. One is, other than the music that you're so passionate about, you've dedicated your life, new music, and all these projects. What do you listen to? If you could share something unusual you listen to that many of your colleagues might not even know that you listen to this genre or this particular artist.
Oh, I'm always sort of changing because I always like kind of dipping into new stuff. I do try and go running
Mhm.
twice a week, roughly. And so I listen to new music, or, sorry, not new music, but I listen to music, and it is new actually, generally, as I run, but it's not contemporary classical generally. It would be, there is a very excellent track by LCD Sound System, which is called something like 45 minutes something, and it's basically built for a 5K run,
Wow.
which is what I do. So that's kind of useful. And I do that when I'm feeling like I can't quite face actually, exploring new sounds. But I've been, recently discovering lots of incredible new voices, like new albums like Jyoti and Angel Bat David, and then going further back to Sun Ra and
Mhm.
other kinds of things. And yeah, I always think there are amazing things to discover in different genres. And actually, recently, because I love live music so much, I realized that part of that is about having some sort of communal experience or something to kind of hook onto that is bigger than yourself. And so I've recently done 2 sound walks, the Ellen Reed Sound Walk in Central Park and the Gelsey Bell Sound Walk in Greenwood Cemetery. And I've really enjoyed that because you're connecting with the composers who've done that work. They're taking you into another story, and you know that other people have also been doing this walk, even though they're not there with you at that time. So I would definitely recommend both of those. They're really fascinating things to do and something that you can do safely at the moment.
Yeah. Two more questions for you. One is something those who have listened to this podcast, I've done over 130 episodes, will know that this is coming. It's the life-changing moment, whether it's a personal life-changing moment or a professional life-changing moment, something that really just impacted your career or life or personal life, if you don't mind sharing.
Sure. I mean, I guess I have to say the first thing that comes into my head, which is the day I moved to Amsterdam for my job at European Cultural Foundation, ended up with me falling off a bike onto a tram line and being in a coma for 5 days. So that was really life changing. In some ways, it was obviously negative in that it takes a long time to recover from something like that. And I was incredibly lucky. They weren't sure if I was going to be the same person I'd been before I'd had the fall. But fortunately, I was fine. I have, some sort of permanent brain damage, but I'm fine. But I guess the life-changing moment of that is that it's very easy to remember that you just don't know how long any of us are going to be here. And so I tend to just be always on kind of high speed, like, let's just go for this, and I'm always on a mission to fit as much as I possibly can into every day of my life, I suppose. And maybe that's why I've always loved traveling a lot as well. I mean, that was the same before I had the fall, but it just made me realize that we're fragile things, and we've got to look after ourselves, but also we've just got to live life to the full and, treat every day as if it could be the last one.
Yeah. And that's such great advice to also young people. But I do like to know a little bit more specific, maybe advice to young musicians. That's my last question for you. Advice to young musicians, especially going through COVID this time. And, it's hard, you get thousands of applications and, people are trying to make a career. It's not easy. What advice would you give them?
I would say, and I'm now going to quote some other people again. I was watching the other day Spike Lee and David Byrne doing an interview about the American Utopia film that is about to come out, which is a film of David Byrne's Broadway stage version of his tour. And I went to see it on my birthday last December, and it's a fantastic, fantastic performance because it's really plugged into what's happening politically at the moment. But he's trying generally to be as optimistic and positive, proactive and encouraging as he possibly can be. And when they were talking about the current climate, Spike Lee and David Byrne were both agreeing that, what's going to get us through this pandemic is actually art, and it's the people who are creating music and working in other art to inspire us. And once we get through it, there is going to be incredible work on the other side of this. So I guess my advice would be do everything you can to be part of that movement. Use this time to be as creative as you can be. Make sure that if, like all of us, you're feeling isolated, do whatever you can to reach out to other people that inspire your creativity. Collaborate with people you never thought you would collaborate with before. And remember that, people are all in the same situation. Everyone is stuck indoors in front of Zoom. So be even more ambitious than you ever have been and try and get someone you thought would never speak to you on a screen, and you might be surprised.
Well, thank you so much. Anything else you want to add before we end?
No, just thank you for the opportunity for this podcast. And anyone wanting to find out more about New Music USA, you can find our website easily. And we've got a great newsletter that you can sign up to as well.
Thank you so much. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks for listening to Let's Talk Off the Podium. If you enjoyed this episode, please comment, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for the next episode.